This video features the animation short Cyber Journalism, followed by an interview between Ron Gula and Chris Bing.
How's it going? Nice op-ed, Jamie. Bing? Have you got that critical infrastructure interview yet?
I'm sorry, Miss Watkins. I have no idea how to get in touch with critical infrastructure.
No idea? Just browse the dark web and get your computer ransomware, or stand in a window and say you are not sure if you want to use two-factor authentication. That will get him.
I think critical infrastructure focuses on bigger cyber threats than those.
Look, you are my star cyber reporter, but if you don't get an interview with critical infrastructure by Friday, you are fired, or worse, I will send you to cover the RSA conference next year.
Understood. I will have an interview with critical infrastructure by Friday. I can't let the world know I'm critical infrastructure and will have to fake this interview. Well, hello there. It's Chris, right? I'm interview for here. Crap! Which is my favorite section of the National Cybersecurity Strategy, crap. And that's why we will have to replace AES 256 with something more resistant to quantum attacks.
Hey, critical infrastructure, prepare to meet your... Oh my, never mind.
Oh man, Chris Bing has an interview with Ron Gula. Time to go.
Hey there, it's Ron Gula. Today I'm here with cybersecurity journalist Chris Bing, and we are going to discuss some of the top 2024 cybersecurity incidents that happened this year. Chris, how's it going?
Hey, Ron, it's going great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. How did you get into cybersecurity journalism?
I started with a political science degree and then got interested in journalism by meeting an alumnus of the college, and really started as a local business reporter covering tech companies. And in this area, so many companies work in defense and cybersecurity, and that just kind of naturally led me to focus on the area.
That's awesome. Now, as a cybersecurity journalist, and that might be what it says in your business card or not, but the general public's perception of cyber, they don't really know all the technology and all the policies and things like that. So how has been covering cybersecurity? What have you learned about the general public, how they view cyber?
Yeah, exactly. So there's certain types of stories that I think the general public has a hard time understanding, whether it's like the difference between a zero-day vulnerability or just a piece of software that is particularly buggy. And I've found that like when you're talking to a general audience, getting to the who, the where, the what, and the why, right? There's been a Russian hacking group. It's targeted this specific type of company. Here's the impact. It's a lot easier to translate for most readers.
And nowadays we have ransomware, and we're going to focus on 2024, but previously we had these big stories. We had the Reveal ransomware takedown. You covered that, but one of the things you covered, which is almost like a James Bond novel, was Project Raven. What was what did you learn about that?
Yeah, so myself and a colleague, Joel Sheckman, in 2019 began like a long-term investigative project at Reuters, where we looked into this issue of former, primarily NSA and CIA officials going to work as mercenaries in the United Arab Emirates. And this was a project where these Americans would go over and they would pursue very similar to work to what they had done back at the agency, hacking, surveillance, and in being able to expose that and talk about that publicly, it's led to a significant change in Congress and also through ODNI. There's now new policies in place that better control sort of where former employees can go to work. There's now a cooling off period, and so we're quite proud of that work.
And it's interesting because on one hand, the general public, that's a real thing, right? You're talking about real businesses doing real offensive cyber work for our allies. We'll kind of use that in air quotes and whatnot. But at the same time, as a cyber profession, you were talking about things that we touch every day. iPhone, zero-day exploits, people who can do offense and defense commercially going to work for intelligence agencies and then applying that. It makes cyber very, very real. Did you get any feedback from the cyber community on that story?
Yeah, we received a ton of feedback. And I think very few people had this idea that offensive cybersecurity has no place or that there's no role for it. It more had to do, I think, with the ethics and where the government controls should exist, right? When you're using an offensive tool to target a human rights defender or a local journalist or sort of a opponent of the regime, there's a different calculation, I think, to it than targeting a terrorist or a foreign nation state threat.
Excellent. So in 2024, and we're filming this in October, so more big stories could happen before the end of the year, right?
Very likely.
But we were talking about some of the biggest stories that happened, and the first one we want to talk about is Change Healthcare. Big story. To me, I think one of the big story parts of this is the fact that it was a supply chain. They were everybody's supply chain, and I never heard of these people. So what happened with Change Healthcare?
So Change Healthcare, this really started around February of this year, and very few people had even heard the name before, right? Change Healthcare, they're a company that processes health insurance claims. So when a doctor's office, a pharmacy, a hospital, really a wide range of healthcare providers interacts with a patient and they're billed, what Change does is they help process the claim to the insurance provider, right? So they play a critical role in the back end. And they experienced a significant ransomware event that locked their systems. The hackers stole proprietary information, client information, patient information, and it paralyzed them significantly. And the downstream effect was that patients couldn't get care.
So I like to say, when I remind people about the importance of cybersecurity, that everybody is somebody else's supply chain.
Yeah.
In this case, Change Healthcare was everyone's medical supply chain, right? So what happened next? How often were people offline, and how long did it take to recover?
I mean, this went on for months, really, and it had really its biggest effect, especially on small healthcare providers who found themselves in a situation where they couldn't bill insurance, so they were taking on those costs. The government did step in and provide some emergency loans, but it was really like a dire situation for some healthcare providers, especially smaller practices, because of that financial cost.
Now, you said the government stepped in, and this is where, like, people outside of cyber, they don't realize that, we have all these great government agencies working hard on the cyber problem, but nobody's responsible for preventing actual ransomware attacks and outages like this, right? If bombs and missiles were coming in, we got all sorts of people. If it was a fire, we got all sorts. Cyber, not so much. So what did you cover much of the role of government, that what could have been done to prevent this and mitigate these things in the future?
Yeah, so I think you make a good point there. In terms of preparing to stop the attack, that falls on the private company and the private organization. They are responsible for their own networks, for defending themselves. Where the government came in was sort of after the fact, right? The FBI investigated. They helped try to deal with the active intrusion at that time. CISA was providing guidance to the larger healthcare sector, saying, here's some of the techniques that worked in this case. Be on the lookout for these so they don't affect you as well. And HHS was the agency that was actually helping provide some of these loans, but many healthcare providers did not feel that they were sufficient, and that partly is due to the scale of the issue.
Now, we had a lot of supply chain attacks in 2024, and when we think about critical infrastructure, which, by the way, thank you for playing critical infrastructure in that introduction video there. Yeah. The concept of, we're so dependent on things like Salesforce, or, the cloud, AWS, and not, OpenAI. I mean, look at how many companies are dependent upon that. Did anybody ever mention, when you were doing these interviews, that, there's this huge dependency in how health, almost like the way we need water. Yeah. What do you think of these kind of dependencies, and what should we be doing about them as a country?
Well, Change Healthcare, I think it's inarguable that they are critical infrastructure. If it wasn't clear before, it's definitely clear now, right, in terms of the impact and how integral they were in this entire process. And, I understand that the government has looked at sort of the issue of monopolization in the healthcare industry, where there's very few providers, and if one gets hit with a cyber attack, it can really affect a lot of providers. But I think the way that DHS and other agencies look at this is that these critical infrastructure sectors should be treated a little bit differently, perhaps with different regulation. This is still an active conversation that has not evolved fully, to be fair. And it's still ongoing, policy is still catching up.
Now, what I think is interesting is that you've got this debate that we're having. We have a free and open press. We have a free and open society. And in many ways, we are talking about major vulnerabilities in our countryside and what we should do about them. on one hand, this is we need to have a robust debate and get the policymakers, the people, the voters, the vendors, everybody involved. On the other hand, do you think this exposes us to more attacks from adversaries? For example, this week we had a Verizon outage in across the country, and people are theorizing that could be yet another cyber attack, and it's probably DNS, right? But does this open society we have impact our infrastructure?
A little bit, right? Like the great thing about America is the freedoms as individuals, as companies, as organizations that we have. I think where this conversation comes is with basic standards, and whether that's 2FA, having a certain level of confidentiality and protection of client data, treating that differently. And there's certain sectors that are obviously more advanced with this, like the financial sector, but with others, let's say like water treatment, things of that nature. This administration is really having some of the first conversations of trying to apply basic cybersecurity standards, and they've received some pushback, right? Like companies do not want to be told what to do in general. And so that's the balance game, right? How much freedom do you sacrifice for security?
How often do you get very polarizing sources for your interviews who want to maybe demand more support from the government, whether it's funding or policy, or blaming the victim, right? These people weren't doing their job, they got hacked. How often do you see those kind of polarizing topics? This is a very complex issue.
Yeah, all the time. I mean, it really goes like in one of two directions, right? Like it's either that the person believes perhaps that the company did not invest significantly in security, they didn't apply even maybe basic protections, and so by that logic, they may be at fault. At the same time, companies who are affected will say, we're facing the Russian government, we're facing a Chinese intelligence agency, like this is probably a situation in which the government should be more involved. But then when there starts to be a more detailed conversation about, actually how much responsibility does the government have, it starts to get very legal and very careful and usually just slows down.
So another major story that happened this year was the Lockbit ransomware group takedown. And this sort of happens a couple years after the Revil ransom group. And this year we had, I'm just going to say his name because I don't get to say the evil guy's names, Yaroslav Vasilaski. I screwed that up. I'll have to fix that and put that there.
You did probably better than I would have done.
But the Russians actually prosecuted him, which I thought was really kind of interesting. Yeah. But what happened with Lockbit?
Yeah, so Lockbit, let's put this in context, right? For years, the United States has been facing significant ransomware attacks on private industry. We just were talking about Change Healthcare. And one of the primary, I think, challenges for law enforcement is that many times the individuals who are responsible are operating from territories where they cannot be extradited, right? Let's say they're in China or in Russia or in a former, Soviet bloc style country, and it's hard to work with local law enforcement to bring them back to the United States to, face a prison sentence or something to that effect. And so there's been a debate, like how effective can law enforcement be when the tools at bay are basically arrest, right? And this operation, which was a takedown of this ransomware group called Lockbit and its affiliates, was unique, and that's sort of why we're talking about it, right? So the government, it was led by the UK government and involved multiple Western partners. Not only did they put out arrest warrants, they also seized internet infrastructure. They doxed the operators. They set up a website. It was quite creative with kind of information that they would be releasing about each of the individual actors involved, and they sort of attacked the reputation of this ransomware provider, which for ransomware providers, their reputation actually means something.
That's hilarious because usually ransomware reputation means like a threat intelligence feed and that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of things that happen with this Lockbit story that this could be a great movie or a Netflix kind of miniseries, right? Hacking groups going against hacking groups. One of the things, and I feel like I'm going to be talking to ChatGPT here because we're going to speculate, but one of the things that happened is our government eventually got the keys to decrypt a lot of this stuff. So imagine, if you will, how they got those keys.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, right? Did they hack the keys? Did they work in some way with one of the crypto wallet providers that was able to provide like a technical solution or a way to track it? I think generally speaking, this idea that Bitcoin is like fully anonymous has been proven wrong, right? Repetitively year over year. Now cyber criminals are using crypto mixing services, which help kind of launder and make it more difficult to trace the pathway for a crypto payment. But even there, we've seen law enforcement be involved in sanctions and arrests and criminal prosecutions of these mixers. And so it feels like in general, law enforcement is getting better at being able to, not to use a pun, kind of decrypt and work backwards to see who's responsible for these attacks.
And I think it's interesting too, because I talk to a lot of people who want to go into cyber. I'm like, you got to learn the technology, right? You got to learn packet traces, memory dumps, file forensics and that sort of thing. But in many ways, if you were going to look at how Lockbit takedown happened and the forensics was gathered, you're dealing with a lot of vendors, cloud vendors, name brands we know. And what they're doing is they're looking at data, the metadata that they have access to, that the EULAs let them, the end user license agreements, when you put data in the cloud, maybe they have the access to look at your files and inspect them for malware. And everybody's got different EULAs, and it becomes very complex then. So again, my question here is more from a press point of view. How do you cover things like titles from the government, different roles and responsibility, and then different vendors' willingness to play ball and not play ball when they're walking the line of maybe like Apple, protecting customer data?
So I think there's not a lot of transparency here, right? The ability for the press to fully understand the backroom arrangements that are happening between the cloud providers, the large software providers, and the government is not something that we usually have great visibility into, right? But it is a critical question because these cyber criminals are effectively customers of these cloud companies. They are in a way customers that are buying domains, and then those companies kind of recognize that the domains are being used in a malicious way, and they're turning over information to law enforcement. And you can argue that it kind of sets a little bit of a dangerous precedent in sort of the willingness of these companies to turn over client files. But I think so far the conversation hasn't tended in that direction. They generally feel that the companies are providing just what's necessary. But yeah, it's very tough to cover, right? Because it's hidden between multiple layers of lawyers, and it's usually handled between the FBI and DOJ.
And in this case with Lockbit, we had one of the U.S.'s greatest allies, United Kingdom, involved. How is the United Kingdom's cybersecurity infrastructure? I'm going to make it sound like they're more organized than the U.S. because it's, they're the size of like California or New York. But how are they different than the U.S. when we have CISA and the FBI and Cyber Command and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think the UK mirrors a lot of the same structure organizationally as the US government when it comes to cyber. I think the one major difference is that the UK set up their NCSC, which is similar in some ways to CISA even earlier. So there was a recognition of critical infrastructure security and the need for that type of role in working with the private sector, as well as some could argue that bureaucratically, the way that the UK prosecutes cybercrime is a little bit more streamlined. This operation was very creative, and I think you can give a certain level of credit to the UK government in that. So we'll see how it develops, but the two governments are fairly similar.
Excellent. So the third topic that we wanted to talk about in 2024, again, there's still time for more stories, right?
Yeah.
But we have actual DNI confirmation of Iranian election interference. What has happened to date as of October 2024 with this story?
So this is a fascinating story, and it involves journalists, hacking, intelligence operations. Around June, July, we know that a group of Iranian hackers known as APT-42 were sending sort of a mass spear phishing barrage at the campaigns, both at that time, the Trump and the Biden campaigns. And they were and this is kind of, your classic spear phishing operation when you click a link, it's a fake login page. If you're not paying attention, maybe you put in the credentials and bam, you gain access. And we do know now through federal indictments, through Justice Department, that multiple Trump campaign officials did fall for this phishing campaign. These Iranian hackers were able to gain access to confidential internal emails and other documents, and they began pitching journalists through fake personas earlier this summer. Now, journalists have not really covered the documents. They've mentioned the fact that there is this sort of weird anonymous persona we now know to be Iran that was offering these documents. And I think it speaks to maybe a change in behavior to 2016 when there was the DNC hack and documents were kind of spread more openly through the press. But as you said, there's a lot of time left and we haven't seen everything to be leaked.
So I think it's really interesting because So Dmitry Alperovich, he helped set up the Defending Digital Campaigns. I was on the board there. We helped fund that when we started. And this is Defending Digital Campaigns is an organization to have anybody running for Congress or political office, governor, to teach them how to secure their own campaigns such that they can be better policymakers, when they get into the White House and stuff. So I'm always amazed when it's election season and hacking happens. But, in that case, you get contacted. Well, I don't know if you got contacted, but your media friends are getting contacted by these people personifying to be, people with intelligence. How do you vet that? Like, how do you find that out? And then how do you balance that as a journalist between, is that a story? Do you go to the media? Like, that puts people in some interesting, compromising positions.
Yeah, it is complex, as you said. I think in this election cycle, right, people were already kind of on guard for this type of tactic where you're using like a fake persona who claims to be a whistleblower and then just provides documents because of what happened in 2016. That's exactly what happened here. There was like an anonymous email account. It was actually an AOL account going under the name Robert, who was reaching out to multiple press outlets with documents saying, I'm an internal Trump campaign whistleblower. I have these things. I think what this kind of sets up, I think in the press generally speaking, is that the bar for coverage is significantly higher, right? If you have questions about the sort of the origin of a document like this, your bar for coverage has to be significantly higher. So I was having this conversation with a colleague the other day. I think if one of the leaks showed and this is just a hypothetical, obviously, but if it showed significant corruption or like in some way like an assault or physical violence, and you're able to, let's say, validate it through secondary sourcing, then you can start to have maybe the conversation of like, despite the origin, is this still so newsworthy for the general public that we should talk about it? But in general, you're probably not going to cover it, right?
It's almost like if somebody actually has election interference, election hacking, actual PCAP, actual logs,
Yeah.
here's the picture of the person changing the votes, right? That sort of thing. The bar is so high, as you say. Otherwise, you're basically claiming you saw a UFO. Because there's even Jen Easterly came out this week. Again, we're recording this in October 2024, saying that the elections are secure. And, so how do you cover this when it's such a polarizing issue?
So there's two types of hacks when it comes to the election, right? There's perception hacks and there's like infrastructure hacks of the vote. Stealing emails for a campaign, putting them out there, trying to divide Americans, go after a particular political candidate. You're trying to sort of influence people's confidence in the political system in general. What Assistant Director Jen Easterly was talking about more specifically was sort of infrastructure itself, right? Voting systems, voting hardware, and how much more secure it is in this cycle than in past cycles and just historically. And I think, I think in the press this is generally understood, but hopefully also in the general public is also well understood. Like it is quite hard to hack and change an election when it comes down to it, right? And your bar for coverage would need to be extremely high with evidence if someone were to make that claim.
And it's so hard for the public to understand just how complex it is. Like a really, really good example I talk about is ballot harvesting, right? If I say ballot harvesting, that's this negative thing. Oh my God, you're harvesting ballots, right? But if I'm helping the elderly vote, well, now I'm a good citizen. I'm helping get the vote out, right? But if I'm only doing it in Democratic areas or Republican areas, I might be trying to influence the vote at that point. So it's so hard to do that. It's kind of what I've seen is like anything that happens from the U.S. inside the U.S., whether it's outright lies by a political candidate or people who are trying to help but maybe not helping as evenly as possible is okay. Anything that happens from Iran, China, Russia, that's election interference.
Yeah.
Are there other types of things that have been going on that you've seen people interfere with these elections?
I think there was an interesting recent blog that Facebook put out through its threat intelligence team where they identified they weren't able to attribute it, right? But it was a US-based misinformation operation on social media targeting, election-related topics like gun control and things of that nature. To my knowledge, it still hasn't been attributed. It was, at the time, it was associated with something called RT Group, which is, to my knowledge, not affiliated with RT, the Russian television network, which there has been some separate reporting on them recently. And I think this just goes to show like some of this is domestic, right? And then how you handle that is different from a law enforcement standpoint. But it's it's just starting. I think we're going to see a lot more.
One of the things I criticize the cyber profession a little bit is that since cyber touches everything, they think they're experts in everything. But one of the things I do like about disinformation operations is they are very similar to malware and botnet operations, right? You typically have a layer of computers distributing this information, so you can cause a story to come in India. Maybe it'll seep into America. Maybe you're posting to meme groups like Reddit and iFunny through malware infrastructures. All that's discoverable by Cyber Command and the NSA, and we could only imagine that they're disrupting these sorts of things. So how much do you think this is science fiction and reality going forward?
It's a great point, right? Like when an actor is conducting this sort of influence operation, what are they doing? They're using domains, right? They're using social media accounts. They're using online infrastructure ultimately to reach American readers. And many of the same techniques that are used by Cyber Command or FBI to investigate a cybercrime case apply. I think it gets a little complex when it comes to freedom of speech, if like the original poster is an American or not, right? If the foreign actor is trying to use like an American local influencer to post that content. What we do know is that in past election cycles, U.S. Cyber Command has disrupted foreign troll farms, has disrupted their infrastructure. This has been reported in the Washington Post. I think we'll continue to see that, right? I think there's broader questions about, which are totally fair, about like how effective are these foreign influence operations? Are we maybe overhyping them in comparison to other threats, like domestic threats? But it's possible to tackle this to some degree.
All right, so shifting gears a little bit, a lot of people have imposter syndrome in cyber, right? They see people who are successful, they want to emulate them, but it takes a lot of people who are kind of where they're at. They took a long way, but you recently graduated from the Johns Hopkins program. Tell us a little bit about your experience with that.
Yeah, so I started a master's program 2 years ago at Johns Hopkins. This is a new program in intelligence and cybersecurity. And the goal there was just really to be more informed on the topics that I cover. And I think that is really important from a journalist perspective, to be aware that you do not know everything and to always seek a little bit of an edge and more information. And it's also crucial for reporting itself on a day-to-day basis, right? Your ability to ask yourself, like, do I really understand that? Do I really know that topic? Am I clear on this? It can save you in a lot of ways from making mistakes. And so Hopkins was a great experience, had some great professors, people who worked in, had legendary roles in government and in the private sector, and just finished this past May.
Congratulations. So if people have a story, right? A UFO lands and the alien gives them a USB hard drive, right? Yeah. How do they contact you? And then what should they expect when they're trying to communicate with you?
Yeah, I've had a few people reach out with alien sightings, and I'm not sure I'm always the best reporter for that. You can reach out to me via social media. I'm on Twitter at Bing_Chris. You can also reach me via email, christopher.bing@tr.com. I'm also on Signal at 202-510-0174. And I encourage people to reach out, from the perspective of a journalist. Like, our ability to accurately report pressing news is based on whether people will reach out who really understand the topic and who really know it. And, some of my sources, they do provide sort of crucial internal information on things that are going on, but some of my sources I just really speak to understand at a technical level what's happening, and to sort of be a checker for whether something is BS or valid or not, because there is a lot of misinformation in this space, and it's important to get the facts right.
Awesome. Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming on the Gula Tech Adventure show this week. Really enjoyed chatting with you, and I would encourage everybody who's watching, if you want to see more interviews like this, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us here on Twitter. Chris, thanks again for coming on today, and best of luck to you in the future, breaking all these UFO, cyber, political influence stories.
Thanks for having me, Ron. I enjoyed it. Take care.